Well, I'm so excited to be with you again. My name is Jeff Fuller, Jay Fuller Interviews. Jay Fuller Interviews on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Jay Fuller Interviews. And now the Backfire podcast with Jeff Fuller, that's myself, of Jay Fuller Interviews. And I believe people's stories make our stories much better as long as we take the time to listen, unlearn what we thought was right, to relearn what is right. And one with a tremendous story is the one, the only Coach Pat Sullivan. Coach, how are you?
Jeff, I'm doing great, and it's great to be with you.
And you were on last time, about almost a year ago or so. But how have you done? How have you been this past year?
Jeff, I've been great. Had a little setback. I had a 7-hour back surgery, and we're still waiting for the nerves to regenerate. But all I got to do, Jeff, is look around. There's tons of people a lot worse off than Pat Sullivan. So, so I'm doing fine.
And there's a lot to be thankful for. I've certainly been reminded of that recently, and I enjoy meeting people and developing friendships, of which you certainly have become over the last few months. Pat, I just want to bring up your website, and it's just coachpatsullivan.com, and it talks a lot about your two books that you've written, but it says that you are a leadership speaker. When you hear that title, what do you think of?
Well, I actually think of my book on attitude as the cornerstone of leadership, and I really believe, Jeff, that the most important thing in a leader is his or her attitude, and the attitude that they bring to their work on a daily basis. And what I've done in the presentation is I've used the word attitude as an acronym and given each letter of the word a characteristic that might make for a quality leader. And real briefly, we talk about attitude, we talk about teamwork, we talk about toughness or tough mindedness. When I talk about intelligence, I like to say this, Jeff. It gets down to your ability to listen and your perseverance to your core values. To me, that's what the intelligent people whom I've been around have done. The third T then is for thank you. So often, the leaders, or as leaders, we don't thank the people with whom we're working. And the letter U stands for you, D is determination. And when I say E for effort, I always like to say, Jeff, effort isn't enough. It must be consistent.
Hmm.
Great ones that I've worked with consistently can bring the best that they've got that day. None of us have our A game every day, but that's a synopsis of what I think of when I think of a leadership speaker.
And so many questions on this that I want to get to in a moment. I listened to a sermon actually this morning, and the preacher said that no wife wants to hear that her husband was faithful 364 days of the previous year. And I think that consistency is such a huge piece. I want to talk about the first T, about toughness or tough mindedness, or the second T, especially getting through a pandemic when people have been mentally tried. How have you maintained that mental awareness to be tough, to be focused, and take that next step each day?
Honest to God, Jeff, an attitude of gratitude,
Yeah.
right? I mean, and then I read somewhere where people were talking about the what World War II was like at home and all the sacrifices
Yeah.
that the American people had to make to help those in combat. And when I read that, I thought, and we got it tough. Come on, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
So I did a lot of reading, did some writing, and my wife and I had great times together. So I missed my family, the 5 children. I missed the 13 grandchildren. Uh, but when all was said and done, Jeff, it really wasn't that tough. I don't think.
And again, Coach Pat Sullivan, coachpatsullivan.com. And Coach, I wonder, as I was adopted, I was raised with a very patriotic family, and you speak of the world wars and how families really had to come together. It almost seems that people are a little bit more selfish than we used to be. Do you think that is true? And as you speak to audiences like that, how do you try to connect with them to be more selfless than selfish?
Well, first of all, I do agree with you. And I think that, we were the beneficiaries of what Tom Brokaw called the greatest generation. And I really believe that because those men and women fought and in a way gave a lot of their youth up doing that.
Yeah.
Then they came home, and for most of them, what did they do, Jeff? They sacrificed
Right.
for us. And I think that the more you're given, the softer you can become. Now, when I first went to the University of St. Francis to coach there, we didn't have a gym. We played in an armory. And Jeff, as God is my judge, the one problem we had in the armory, we couldn't get heat. It was definitely a dilapidated armory. But I often think of those kids, they had to get in a van, get to practice every day in an armory. The floor was like playing on concrete, and you're coaching basketball. You know what I'm talking
Yeah,
about.
yeah.
I worried about shin splints every day. And then when we got our gym on campus, we were in that armory for 11 years. I think that when we got the gym, that maybe those kids didn't appreciate
Mm.
as much what they had. And I always think back to the sacrifices. And here was the beautiful part, Jeff. I never heard the kids complain.
Yeah.
They just got in the vans. We went to the armory. We practiced, and we ended up with some pretty good teams. Despite those circumstances. So I do think we've been given so much that you really have to be careful not to be thankful for all we have.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think how you grew up, that's what you remember, or hopefully you return to those values. And my dad, he's 84 years old. Him and my mom celebrated their 58th wedding anniversary June 6th. But this morning, my dad is on our backyard cutting up some firewood with a chainsaw. And I said, Dad, you do not have to do that. He's like, I know I don't have to, but I want to help you out in that work ethic. I think growing up on a farm at the tail end of the Great Depression and hearing all those stories, it just developed something within him, and hopefully I can carry that on as
And,
well.
and Jeff, I hope the same. My dad went to sixth grade, and for a good reason. It was the Depression, and he actually that young could get a job and help his family out. And when I think of Dad, and like you're saying with the farm, Dad worked in factories all his life. And how did Mark Twain say it? Don't let school interfere with your education.
Yeah, yeah.
And and I really believe all the PhDs that I work with, they were wonderful, but not one of them had the wisdom of my father. And so I hope that as I grew, I maybe part of that wisdom, rubbed off on me.
I'm certain it did. And Pat, just thank you so much for making the time to join again. Your book that you came out with the last time we spoke is Team Building from the Bench to the Boardroom. And we talked about Rudy Rudiger and how he wrote the foreword to that. Could you just share again how you met Rudy and how this all came to be and that friendship with him?
It's funny that you ask. About 2 hours ago, I had to go into this business to turn something in. And the person who works there is Rudy's sister, Norma. So I have known the family even before I knew Rudy. We both went to the same high school. Then, ironically, Jeff, the first job I had was at a different high school, Providence High School. And it was on what would be the east side of Joliet. And Rudy's family grew up in that area. So as you know from talking to him, he grew up in a family of 14 children.
Yeah.
And he had the greatest mother and father you could ever meet. So I knew Rudy when he was in high school. I really got to know him when I was at Providence, where I taught or coached 8 of the Rudiger children. So Rudy and I became pretty close then, and we've done some speaking actually together in recent years. And I just admire what he has done. And how about it, Jeff? If you looked in the dictionary under perseverance, there'd be no words.
Right.
Just Rudy's picture.
That's so true. And for you, Coach Pat Sullivan, CoachPatSullivan.com, not the important stuff, but probably the stuff we talked about was more important. But where my interest is you are a basketball coach, and you've coached many players at many teams, been around some high profile athletes, coaches as well. When you think about going in and knowing something versus going in and wanting to learn something, how valuable is the second?
It's everything. It's everything. A great example of that is my friend Pete Turgovich. He played on John Wooden's last team at UCLA. So at that point, Jeff, Coach Wooden's teams had won 9 NCAA championships and 7 in a row. So he was probably a pretty good coach. And Pete will tell you, throughout that whole year, John Wooden was telling his players how much he was learning about the game.
Wow.
And he learned enough that particular year to win UCLA's 10th national championship. So if Coach Wooden could say that he was learning after all that success, I think when we think that we've got even most of the answers, we better check our oil.
Yeah.
Because there's much more we have to learn.
Oh, that's a great point. And talk to me a little bit about, I mean, the game has changed now collegiately. I certainly have not coached at that level, but with transfer students, with all of this talk, and it was sad for me to see, being a North Carolina Tar Heel fan,
Sure.
the coaches resigning, even Coach Krzyzewski being a Tar Heel fan. It was sad to hear him saying this is his final year. But what can you say about some of these students that are, I don't want to sound cynical, but I guess I am, that are given promises that they can go to a college or go to transfer to a college for a year, then go make big money in the NBA? How wary should these kids be? When you were coaching, who else was speaking into their lives just to give them wisdom and not just be looking at the next greatest thing or the greener pasture they thought was on the other side of that fence?
Jeff, that's a great question. I think I was fortunate because I grew up, think of these guys I grew up with: Dean Smith, John Wooden, El McGuire. And when you think of all those guys, this bothers me today. The one thing that their players did in that era when I grew up, they graduated.
Yeah.
They knew why they went to the university. And I've always said this: if anybody didn't have to go back and get his degree, it was that North Carolina guy named Jordan. He was going to be able to feed his family, whether he got that degree from North Carolina or not. But he went back and got it. Yeah. And he went back and got it because that was the culture. So what we're doing today, I don't like. I think this rule that you can just walk in and say, I'm going to transfer, is so unfair to the universities.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I've worked with you all year or 2 years or whatever it may be, Jeff. And now we're at a point where we got a chance to really be a good team. And at the last minute, you're going to transfer and have immediate eligibility. I don't like it. Even the thing that was passed, I don't understand all of it. um, yesterday by the Supreme
Yeah.
Court, where we have to give the kids every educational advantage, whatever that means. Um, I'm thinking of this. I'm the father of 5 children. Nobody came and gave them a
Right.
full.
Right.
How about it, Jeff? And most of the people you and I know who have college degrees also have college loans,
Yeah.
right? And so I Woody Hayes said it this way. Why would we ever pay the, and I know I'm in a minority, but I still believe this. Why would we ever pay the athletes when we are paying for the best thing that we can give them, their education?
Yeah.
So now when we got these guys transferring only because of basketball and have an education on the back burner, I vehemently disagree with that. And Jeff, as you know, I'll finish with this on this point. I think the Division threes and the Division twos and the NAIAs are the ones today doing it right.
Yeah.
First of all, they don't have money. You
Right.
know, they don't have all the money to buy athletes and all that nonsense. But what's going on? Their kids are graduating. We had 176 seniors play at St. Francis. 172 of them finished their degrees.
Hmm.
And that's what's going on at our smaller schools.
And that's wonderful. I had the opportunity to interview Coach Adam Hooker at Sterling College at NAIA school, and he just talked about that as well, and the importance of kids understanding what life is all about. And Doug Gottlieb, I had the good fortune of interviewing him, and he takes a very similar take as you and I about paying kids in college, but they need to understand what they are getting, not just the education, but everything else, access to the facility, the medical care is just beyond what your typical college student gets or receives. But my question is, in your first book, Attitude, the Cornerstone of Leadership, I wonder if this plays in as well. And I find it some, and even the local church that I pastor, what has happened to loyalty?
Wow. Well, you said earlier, don't ever forget where you came from. And the neighborhood that I grew up in, I guess you would call a poor neighborhood. It was certainly on the wrong side of the tracks. And you know what, Jeff? I wouldn't trade that neighborhood for anything, for nothing. We were Irish, Italian, and black. And you didn't need a sociologist or anyone to tell you we're all one thing. We're all the human race. Come on, you know. And to me, that was the greatest part of my growing up. That I could be the only white youngster in the playground with 50 black kids. And what was the factor? The factor wasn't whether you were white or black. The factor was, could you play?
Yeah.
Could you play or couldn't you play? And you just learned that you should be. I'm so grateful where I grew up, and and I'll never forget the camaraderie in that neighborhood. Another guy from our city, Jeff. His name is Tom Thayer. Played at Notre Dame. Played on the '86 Bears. The best Bear team in Chicago Bear
Yeah. Yeah.
history.
Yeah.
Tommy has never forgotten that he came from little old Joliet.
Hmm.
You know, and that's one of the beauties of him, that he's loyal to where he came from. And I and again, what you're saying, this new rule about transfer and you're immediately eligible, where's the loyalty?
Right. Right.
Yeah, I think that's wrong.
Yeah, and I look at scouts and all the work they do, and a lot of colleges, they do not get paid enough or very much. And then after all that hard work, a student just goes to go somewhere else. I think it's disappointing and it's too bad. I just want to back up in your history. When did you first realize you enjoyed sports?
Probably about fifth grade, because we were fortunate. They called it the CYO back then.
Yeah.
And And our teams, we could start competing in fifth grade. And then, of course, we had the Little League in the summers. So I remember distinctly, I started in my baseball at 9 years old. And I'm sure, I don't know how old you are in fifth grade, 11, maybe 12, however old you are. But that's when I just came to love sport. And my dad loved sport. So that was certainly a factor, Jeff. But that early.
What sport did your dad play or play with you? Do you remember just playing catch or shooting baskets or kicking around a soccer ball as a kid?
When my dad was coming up during the Depression, he was a catcher in baseball, and he played guard in basketball. But my dad's fingers looked like the Mississippi River. They were they were all crooked from catching and foul tips, hitting your hand. And I remember Dad telling me there were no emergency rooms in those days, Jeff. He said they took a handkerchief and would tie your two fingers together and went back out and played. So so Dad was a major factor because he loved sport, and I just myself, my brother, we immediately took up that same love.
What led you to basketball?
I I think that in my younger years, Jeff, these are great things to recall. Our basketball, we didn't have, much like St. Francis, we didn't have a gym. Okay, so we practiced outside. Now the Chicago area can get a little rough in the winter. And the court we practiced on had the chain nets, so nobody would be stealing them. And it was actually a gravel surface. So we would practice. We'd have to shovel the snow, and then our coach was Dick Vicino. Dick would get us ready to practice. You're going to love this. Often we were practicing in our boots, our galoshes. And here's what Dick would tell us: "You guys, you're lucky, because when you go into a gym and you take those boots off and you put on those gym shoes, you're going to jump higher."
Yeah.
We believed it. And so I think that we were fortunate. Again, we were from the wrong side of the tracks. Well, so what do? You play ball all day.
Hmm.
So we had some pretty good teams. And then when I went into high school, I went into a high school that was sport oriented, academically as well, obviously, but sport was important. And I gravitated to the basketball because I'd had a little bit of success, and was able to play on the teams in high school.
Now, did you know, or when did you know that you wanted to coach?
My senior year at high school, our faculty used to play the seniors. Now the senior basketball players were not allowed to play because the faculty had to win. So primarily our football guys played in that game. So they asked me to coach them. And I'll never forget, after the game, one of the coaches whom I greatly admired said to me, "You ought to think about coaching."
Hmm.
And I think that was the first time that I really thought I love sport, and maybe that should be the way to go. Then I went to college, and this is where I'm prejudiced, Jeff. I think I played for maybe the best college coach in America. Now, he was at a small college, so a lot of people didn't know him. Well, he's the second winningest coach. His name was Gordy Gillespie in the history of college baseball. His basketball career, he played for Hall of Fame coach Ray Meyer at DePaul University, and they once played for the national championship. Then in football, his when they started the state championships in football in Illinois, well, Gordy won at the high school level. He coached both high school and college. He won 5 of them. And he only coached during that reign for about 6, 7 years. At one point, they won 51 in a row. So think about it. How many coaches could excel at all 3 sports at a pretty high level? I mean, when I played pitch for Gordy at at Lewis College, Lewis University. Now we played Notre Dame, we played the University of Illinois. We played the bigger schools, and we had some pretty good players, Jeff. So we won our share. In fact, we beat the U of I 10 years in a row. So that wasn't bad.
Again, Coach Pat Sullivan makes some time on YouTube. Check out the YouTube channel, Coach Pat Sully, and the website is coachpatsullivan.com. Before, when you were on, you spoke of Rick Majerus and some of the coaches that you were able to rub shoulders with and be around. Could you just share when a coach that you looked up to, that you were mentored by, that you're an associate with, passes away? Coaching is such a small family when you really look at it. How has that affected you, seeing more and more of these great coaches just leave this earth?
It's really affected me because it's affected the game in a way I don't like. The coaches, Rick was the same as L and Coach Wooden and Coach Smith. Rick's kids graduated. So in an era where kids weren't graduating, Rick's kids did. And if I'm not mistaken, his Utah team, when they played Kentucky for the national championship, I'm pretty certain this is correct. Jeffy had 3 academic All-Americans on that team. And I went out and I worked Rick's camps. So I got to know his Utah players. When he came to St. Louis, we would go down there, and we'd watch like 3 days of practice in the preseason. And same thing at St. Louis. Those kids graduated. Marquette, same way. So Rick, I think I've used this terminology before when we talked, Jeff. I thought Rick was like a basketball savant. His knowledge of the game was absolutely off the charts. And I never saw him take a note. It was all up here. He was amazing that way. And then, like we're saying, I had a unique experience, Jeff. I worked for a company in part-time doing clinics all over the country for him, directing clinics. So I got a chance to work a one-man clinic with Dean Smith. So you had Coach Smith for 4 hours in the hotel, only him, talking about philosophy and so forth. Then on Friday night, Saturday, you went to the gym for 7 hours. He taught. And I'm lucky to have that with Hubie Brown, to have that with Bob Knight, to have that with Dean Smith. So you're taking copious notes because you're fortunate to be learning from the best. And again, they were such solid men, and they were men of faith. They had spiritual background, regardless of the formal religion.
Right.
All of them were spiritual men who treated a nobody like me, they had no idea when I started doing those clinics with them who I was. Well, they treated everybody with such kindness. And I often said this, Coach Wooden and Coach Smith could be awaiting the shuttle to get to the airport. The clinic is over. Their speech is over. And I'm telling you, Jeff, if there was a 5th grade coach there, they'd be sitting with that coach while waiting for the shuttle.
Wow.
They were that kind to everyone.
Yeah, what a lesson we can learn from that. And I like what you said about being spiritual, or the holistic coaching. Sometimes the X's and O's, but sometimes these gentlemen, these coaches, they knew people even better. And how people, you might forget what someone says, but you'll always remember how they make you feel. And what you just shared is representative of that. I just want to bring up one player. Andre Miller played at Utah. He is one of the few players that had a triple-double during March Madness, had a great pro career. For him to have a triple-double in that game, that era, how much should that stand out or amaze? Because I still remember, because I graduated high school in 93, so it was right around that time. And I just remember it was just amazing to see, especially in March Madness, a player get a triple double. Can you talk about Andre Miller or players of that era that really did everything just in an effort to make their team win?
I think you're really going to like this. We were in Chicago. It was a Friday night. Andre Miller was graduating from the University of Utah Saturday. Rick Majerus, we were all together. Rick took an early flight from O'Hare, Chicago O'Hare, because he promised Andre Miller's mother when he was recruiting him from South Central LA that he would be at his graduation.
Wow.
So that really encapsulates everything we're talking about, doesn't it? Yeah. That Rick is in Chicago, but by gosh, he's going to get to Utah because he made a promise. Andre Miller, I mean, I don't know if Rick knew just how great a player he was going to become, how great a pro that he was going to become. And he and Rick just had a marvelous relationship till the day Rick passed.
Coach, if you would, CoachPatSullivan.com, it talks about the corporate motivational speaking. And now that COVID has kind of loosened some of the guidelines and you're going to be able to travel more, can you just talk a little bit about switching from the hardwood, the basketball court, to a corporate setting and speaking? Was that something you had to adjust to? Were you intimidated by? Or what's it like to speak in that setting versus as far as inside a gymnasium?
I was intimidated by it. And then when I wrote my second book on team building, Jeff, I found 20 concepts that I thought were important in building a team in the athletic arena. Then I researched in business literature each concept. And I then found that building a team in athletics really is no different than building a team in business.
Yeah.
Or in many arenas, I think, because some of the concepts that we thought were important, the first one I think is the most important, that as a leader in business or in athletics or any venue, caring. You've got to care about the people in your charge. And I always love that expression from John Maxwell. People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care.
Yeah.
And so I think things like caring, knowledge, continuous learning, which we talked about. You got to be a lifelong leader, learner. How about things like failure? How do you handle failure? How about success? How do you handle success? How about your individual ego versus your team ego? So I found that all those characteristics, when you research the business literature, they were one and the same. And then finally, I think what helped me was that I realized that the great majority of business leaders, men and women, understood and appreciated athletics. Now, and I was worried about the woman's side, and I was wrong, because the younger woman had the benefit of Title IX.
Yeah.
And they played. And those that were older, they drove their kids to volleyball games and tennis matches all over.
Right.
So they saw the value of sport from their own children. So I found that there was a very close correlation between athletic leadership and business leadership.
So, Coach, a couple fun questions, then we'll get you out. Thanks again for making the time. Coach Pat Sullivan, it's Coach Pat Sully on YouTube. If you were asked to do a coach's clinic and they just said you can pick what you want to focus on, whether it's defense, ball handling, passing, what do you naturally go towards in that realm of teaching basketball?
Without question, the fundamentals. And I say that, and we did things maybe a little differently, Jeff. Before we ever taught dribbling, passing, shooting, rebounding. We taught body balance, and we taught footwork, starting, stopping, pivoting. Because when you think about it, the whole game of basketball emanates from balance, because balance leads to quickness. And it's not enough to do the fundamentals properly. If you're going to be a good player, you've got to be able to do them properly and quickly.
Yeah.
And then I really believe one of the lost arts that's not being taught to the extent that it should be taught today is footwork. You know, when you think about it, your change of direction dribbles, they all depend on footwork.
Yeah.
If Rick Majerus was doing a shooting drill, the only thing he talked about was their feet.
Hmm.
You know, passing, you better have good balance before you. I mean, balance and footwork permeate every fundamental. So that's what I talk about. And when I have been asked to speak at the clinics and they say, what topic would you like? I always say that, because I think if I can give the coaches some of the little things within the fundamentals, then maybe I can help them with their teaching.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think attention to detail, because
Oh,
sometimes we assume too much for some of these kids or some of these students that, oh, they know what it means to be unbalanced, but they don't. They know like all these fancy dribble moves, but just to catch square is new for them. Why? Well, let me ask you, did you ever think about or ponder the possibility of coaching professionally?
well, I did have some offers actually to go with Rick Majerus, and I there were reasons why I elected not to. Rick always gave me a hard time about it, but I was invited to a couple NBA think sessions, think, but uh, no, I never did think about the NBA. I did think about Division One, and I have friends, one in particular who spent 26 years as an assistant coach in the NBA with 9 teams. And you can imagine how the knowledge, right, Jeff, that he has from being able to coach at the highest level with 9 different philosophies.
Right.
Yeah. So his name is Bob Osipka. In fact, he wrote a book, The Plays of the NBA. And I, looking back, I have no regrets whatsoever. But if I could have a year or two working in the NBA where the only thing you're doing is basketball and your relationships with the players. That's all. You don't have to worry about graduation. You
Right.
don't have to worry about class. You're strictly doing basketball, studying film. I would have enjoyed that.
Coach, you mentioned the name Hubie Brown, and Hubie's still doing it, and he's quite the gentleman from all reports that I've heard. Why do you think he is so good still, whether it's on TV or on calling games, but just as interpersonal relationships? What is it about gentlemen like Hubie Brown that just seemingly continue to make an impact on the sport of basketball?
Well, I'm lucky there too, Jeff. I got to know UB pretty well. He would come to the camps that we ran in Chicago 3 times every summer. So think about that. You're there listening to him, and every time he spoke, I learned something. Every
Hmm.
time. That's how detail oriented UB was. Then we went down to Atlanta when he was coaching there, because he invited coaches in to their preseason. And I'll never forget, one of the kids, one of the Atlanta players, was injured. And here's what he said, Jeff. He came and sat with us, and he said, coaches, he said, I played on 5 different NBA teams, 5 different coaches. He said, I have learned more in this camp from UB Brown than I did from the 5 coaches combined. And I think the reason that UB is so good on the game is when he was an assistant coach at Duke, he went up and down the East Coast doing camps. And I feel from all the years I did in the camps, I may have learned more, Jeff, in the camps than I did the clinics because why? You're with your peers
Right.
and you're with them for a week. So I think UB's background in all the camps, plus the fact the guy is brilliant. He's just a brilliant guy on or off the court. And the detail, I don't think I ever worked with or listened to a coach as detailed as UB.
And again, we're talking to Coach Pat Sullivan, coachpatsullivan.com, and a couple more questions. The more that I listen, the more questions I have, but I know that time is relatively limited. But students that don't play basketball in the off season, or coaches that don't go to clinics or really grow their mind when they're not coaching, how does it hurt their development? But just, and I guess I'm coming from an angle. I think life skills, you always need to be learning. And sometimes we want to take a day off and we don't realize how it's going to impact us in the future. So whether it's that of sport or whether that's just in life, how important is it that we don't take that proverbial day off?
Oh, I mean, it's critical. You know, the moment you stop learning as a coach, you're really in trouble. And one of the best clinics that I went to in my latter years of coaching was not a clinic. I would call a coach whom I had great respect for, often a high school coach. Chicago area, we have some terrific high school coaches. And I would go with an agenda and spend 5 hours. And that was the best clinics. In fact, one day Rick called me, George Karl, of course, at that time was coaching the Bucks. And he said, how would you like to come to Milwaukee and spend 2 days with George and I just talking basketball? I said, well, I believe I got those 2 days. I'm free. But what I did, Jeff, and you would do the same, I'm sure. I wasn't going to sit with those two minds. And of course, George Karl was a Tar Heel, played in North Carolina.
Yeah.
I wasn't going to sit with those guys without selfishly asking questions that I wanted to learn about. So I think I had 25 questions that I had written up, and you couldn't have got better answers from those guys. So you got to keep learning. With the players, I got a little bit of a different angle. I like multi-sport athletes, Jeff.
Yeah.
I think when kids have to learn different sports, then they're learning different fundamentals. They're really learning to listen and to work on those fundamentals. So I like guys who played multiple sports, but also did their basketball, in the evenings because they love the game.
Right.
And I don't know what's right anymore. I know the AAU programs give the kids opportunities we never had. But also there was something about going to the playground, and not having any adults around and just playing ball because you loved it. So I would hope the kids today definitely do the AAU. But also get with your buddies and just play pickup games.
I agree with that. Often I've seen, and this is in the Northeast, so it's not necessarily a basketball hotbed, but unless there's a scoreboard and referees, you don't see kids playing as much. And all you need is one kid that can count to 21, and you're all set and you're good to go. But it's something that I used to do, and it's sad for me, and I'm that person now, that I drive by the town court and nobody's playing, and it's like what a waste. And just get out there and shoot and play. And we actually play old man pickup now Tuesday Thursdays because, well, we weren't allowed in the gym, but playing on blacktop full court, maybe that's why some of these kids aren't playing as much, because I know my body hurts after that. But Coach, again, I just respect you so much. And I think so much of what you shared, I've seen personally from you. And going to a clinic or a seminar, it's great. But having someone that you can reach out individually and know that they care, I think that's all that people need sometimes, to know that, their questions are being listened to, they are being answered. And you responded a couple times to me this past year about something specific that I was asking about coaching. And I just appreciate your integrity and not just talking about it, but actually doing it so much. So I just wanted to say thank you, Coach,
Well,
for being
let,
there for me.
let me finish with one thought. Having coached 44 years, if I had to say, what's coaching about? I get it to one word: relationships. You're so blessed to work with great kids. That's what it's all about. And thank you. I thoroughly enjoy visiting with you, Jeff.
Well, definitely. And the last question that I have for you is kind of because I'm curious, and I grew up in Vermont when everybody was a Celtics fan. And as I mentioned,
Right.
I'm 46 years old, so the 80s were the prime time of my basketball love, where it really developed. So I grew up a Lakers fan, not a Celtics fan. And then since growing up and being here, I follow the Celtics a lot more now. For you, who are the two teams that you were in conflict on? Who should you like, whether it was basketball or whether it was football or a different sport?
It would be our Chicago Bulls. When I was younger, they were just beginning, of course.
Right.
Uh, so like you now, I went with the Celtics. Celtic fan more than a Laker fan, although I love Magic and the teams he played on. But boy, what a rivalry that was. And I just loved, and that expression that I mentioned earlier came from Bill Russell. Here's what he said. He said, when the Celtics walked into a building for practice or a game, we took our individual egos, we left them at the door. But what we had was team ego. That you may beat us, but if you're going to beat us, you better bring a great game because we know we are.
Yeah, that team ego, that's something to be said and something to be proud of. That's something that I miss. And my son, who's a freshman in college now, and he wasn't an all-star, but he just misses being on a basketball team, practicing together, being on bus rides together, going on trips together. There's really nothing like it. So take full advantage if you're at that age and are able to do so. But Coach, thanks so much for making the time, and we'll get you on again soon.
I'd love to, Jeff. Take good care and thank you.
And again, that's Coach Pat Sullivan, coachpatsullivan.com. Also on YouTube, it is Coach Pat Sully. And I do want to talk about his latest book, Team Building from the Bench to the Boardroom. So maybe you're not a sports fan, but you want to learn leadership lessons, certainly jump to that. And then attitude, as he broke down the cornerstone of leadership, attitude, relationships. We all can do better and we all can live more if we'll just make the time to listen to one another and to learn from each other. With that, I'm out. Thanks so much. Jay Fuller Interviews, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter. And now the Backfire Podcast with, yes, myself, Jeff Fuller of Jay Fuller Interviews on Apple iTunes and Google Podcasts. Thanks, everybody.